Davis, living in Greensboro, Bend. This is November 2nd, 1986. Oh boy, don't stop it from me. What am I going to talk about?
Well, what about the Bend when you were a young Warner?
Oh, when I was young, everything was slower than it is now, especially the traffic. There were very few automobiles, and there were many trains. We could go to Hardwick at 8 o'clock in the morning and return at 11 o'clock. We could go to St. Johnsbury shopping on the train and in the morning and come back in the afternoon. Okay?
Yep.
Almost every train that went through Greensboro Bend stopped for coal and water, or one or both, because there were steam engines. Let me see. There was a coal shed and a water tower which supplied the trains. It kept somebody shoveling coal by hand most of the time. Stop it a minute. Yeah, let's see. There was a section gang which took care of there were several section gangs on the railroad which walked the tracks and to keep them in good condition, which is different than today. They ride over the tracks at such a speed that they do not see any of the faults. Now how do you stop it? Over there? The engines could turn around if they had come from St. Johnsbury. They could turn the engine around and go back to St. Johnsbury in either direction because of a Y in the railroad tracks. Everything moved by rail then. We operated a grocery store, my father did, and all of our freight came by rail. One of my early recollections was bringing the freight from the railroad depot to the store on a wheelbarrow. We would ship eggs to Boston, and the railroad brought the empty cases back for a nickel apiece. I don't remember what they charged when they were full. A big change in merchandising. In the old days, the clerk in the store got everything the customer wanted. Nothing was self-service. All of the canned goods in our store were on the top shelf. We had to reach for them, and anything you wanted, the clerk got. Our store sold everything to eat and wear, I used to say. We had a hardware store beside us, which we did not interfere with them by selling hardware, and they didn't interfere with us by selling groceries and clothing. The big business in dry goods was in the fall and in the spring, when people changed to either warm clothes or cooler clothes, especially in the fall, when everyone bought woolens. There were no synthetics in those days. Many farmers paid for their groceries with eggs. One of the big problems when I was young was candling eggs, because sometimes the eggs were not too fresh, especially in July and August. The rest of the year, we were safe in taking eggs as they came in. We shipped eggs to several places in New Hampshire, in the White Mountains in the summertime, and to Boston the rest of the year.
You get any idea what the...
We paid from 8 to 15 cents a dozen for eggs. And groceries were comparable in price, so many families paid for their groceries with eggs. As I remember it, the mail came in twice a day. When I was young, I sold Curtis Publishing Company papers, the Country Gentleman, the Saturday Evening Post, each for a nickel. The Ladies' Home Journal cost 10 cents. And I peddled papers each weekend around town. I was much embarrassed when my parents would make me go on the train to peddle the papers to the passengers on the train. I didn't like that part of my work. I rode a bicycle all over Stannard, Walden, and around Greensboro Bend, peddling these papers for a nickel. When I was young, all of the small town post offices were in general stores. The one I remember most was Ed Collins, E.R. Collins, who had the post office for many years and the general store. And now they have their separate buildings for post offices.
In Saxony.
The mail was sorted on the trains by railway mail clerks in those days. And now it has to travel almost 100 miles away from one town to get to the town that's 5 miles away. Greensboro Bend was a business center when I was young, so everything which moved by rail had to come here. There was a sawmill and a creamery. The railroad men used to come into the store and buy butter and eggs and some clothing, because while they were taking on coal and water, some of the trainmen could run down and get a lunch or whatever they needed to take home to St. Johnsbury. At one time, they shipped 35 carloads of Christmas trees out of Greensboro Bend in the fall. And now the business has gone to Canada because the trees are better, the dealers say. When I was a teenager, in the wintertime, we had basketball games in East Hardwick and Greensboro. We would walk 3 miles to East Hardwick or Greensboro, play basketball, and then walk home when the game was over. Sometimes it was way below zero when we were doing all this. When I was first married, my wife and a friend of hers, Margaret McDonald King, walked to Greensboro and played basketball, and on the way home, Margaret froze her knees because it was so cold. My education ended with high school. My parents thought if I didn't want to be an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor, why should I waste my time in college? My father and grandfather opened Davis store in 1893. My father was 18 years old when the store opened, and so he was right there from the beginning until he died in 1959. I took over then and operated the store until 1969 when I closed it. A lot of our business in those days was credit. and people would pay up once or twice a year. One of the questions I've been asked is, how did you meet your spouse? I met her at Linden Institute in high school on a snowshoe trip with she and her sister and my sister. And about 10 years later, we were married. My wife's father, John Nash, worked for the Boston and Maine Railroad, and he was paymaster when he paid everyone in cash on the Montpelier and Wells River, the St. J and LC, and other small railroads. In speaking of railroads, my mother tried to make a musician of me. I had to go to Hardwick on Saturday on the 8 o'clock train and take a half-hour music lesson. I'd come back on the 11 o'clock train. They paid for 1/2 hour. They thought it was great. But the teacher would keep me for an hour, which I didn't appreciate. Oh, I forgot to mention, it was a piano I was playing. I remember when it was next to impossible to go to Hardwick or Barton in the spring because the mud was so deep. There was always 1 or 2 mud holes that was impossible to get through. In winter, there were cradle holes in the road. We called them cradle holes all the way from Greensboro Bend to Greensboro. All of our refrigeration in the store in the early days was with ice, which was cut on Caspian Lake and brought by sleds, double teams, to our store. One of my early recollections when I was 6 or 8 years old was putting my wet lips on a cake of ice, which froze instantly. I don't remember how I got away. Those double cakes of ice sometimes weighed over 400 pounds. We had to pack the ice in sawdust and use it all the next summer for refrigeration. We sold ice cream and soda. We used to pack 10-pound boxes of Frankfurts on the ice and cover them up with sawdust until we needed them. That was our refrigeration. Due to the sawmill being in town, we had a big mill pond, and we could skate for a 1/4 mile in the fall up the river because of the mill dam. Every little town had a sawmill and a mill dam, which prevented the problems which they have in Hardwick now with ice. The mill dams held back the ice until the ice melted. I am old enough to remember the end of World War I, or I think it was the end of World War I, because there was an armistice declared, which really wasn't true, but I was floating on a raft in the middle of this mill pond in Greensboro Bend. All the church bells were ringing. We could hear the whistles from the stone sheds in Hardwick, which were operating at that time. On rainy days when conditions were right, we could hear the noon whistle and the 5 or 6 o'clock whistle at night of the granite sheds in Hardwick. It is 7 miles from Hardwick to Greensboro Bend. One of my early recollections of working in the store when I was 8 or 10 years old, I had charge of keeping the candy case in good condition. I had to sample everything to make sure that it was fit to sell. My father was born on what is now called the Sparhawk place in Wheelock. My mother was born in Stannard. They spent their married life living over the store in Greensboro Bend. The Methodist Church here has put on a game supper each fall. There's been a contest between Stannard and Greensboro Bend as to who would produce the most game for the supper. The game would count different numbers of points, such as 1,000 or 200 hedgehogs' feet counted. They had to bring in all 4 hedgehog feet because some of the hunters would make out that one hedgehog was 2 hedgehogs. This game supper started in 1923 and has been going ever since, excepting 2 or 3 years during World War II.
You remember what the cost was?
I have sold tickets for several years. I found an old ticket that was 50 cents and 75 and $1. This past year it was $5.50. When the game supper started, it was mostly a local thing because people couldn't travel the way they do now. They come from Connecticut, Massachusetts. Some people come every year and look forward to coming when the game supper is being served. The hunters were supposed to live in either Stannard or Greensboro Bend, but we used to get hunters from Hardwick and other towns to hunt for each side trying to outdo the other. Dr. Beaupre and Pop Barr from Hardwick worked for either Stannard or Greensboro Bend. They had dogs and were great hunters.